for having me again. So this is, I don't know why I started working on Edward Fulton. I know that he kind of come in contact with William Hines Furbish, another African-American legislator, which I've written about. So that was why I first learned about him, but somehow I came across more interesting information about him, and I started to research him. He was a legislator in Drew County, which is right next door to Chico County, so that was kind of a regional thing for me as well. But before I get into Fulton, I'll just tell you that where I work for Arkansas State University, and I work at the Lakeport Plantation at ASU. We have 4 heritage sites. We have Lakeport, obviously. We have the Hemingway Pfeiffer House, and we have the Southern Tenant Farmers Museum, and we have the Dias Colony, where Johnny Cash's boyhood home is. But I work at Lakeport, and I feel like I need to talk about Lakeport a little bit because they allow me to do this kind of research that's kind of outside of the purview of everything that happens at Lakeport, but about regional history and African American history. But we have a lecture series at Lakeport that I thought I'd plug that starts this month. And we try to talk about regional history, Southeast Arkansas, Chico County, but also a little bit of Mississippi history as well, since we're just 2 miles or so from Mississippi. So this month we have a lecture by Dr. Brian Lockhart about the meandering Mississippi River and how it's influenced human civilization. I'm going to talk about James Worthington Mason next month, another African-American legislator, and I'll talk about him in this talk as well. But he was the son of Elijah Worthington, the largest planter in Arkansas and largest slaveholder right there in Chico County. And we got Becky Howard talking about some Italian history. Sunnyside Plantation was right next door to Lakeport, and the Italians came there in 1895. A lot of them also went to Taneytown. That's where Becky gets involved. Her ancestors came from Sunnyside to Taneytown. And then we've got some mid-century architecture in June. We had a mid-century architecture for Mississippi Delta last year, so we've got Arkansas Delta this year. And then we've got Jennifer Bond and Brenda Davis, who both work at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History as architectural historians. So I'm talking about the Mississippi Capitol. And then I'm going to talk about, in August, U.S. Colored Troop pension files and my search for former slaves in Chico County in those pension records. But today I'm going to talk about Edward Fulton, an African-American legislator. I like to talk about my sources. For doing African-American history, it's very difficult to find good primary sources. The 2 really good primary sources that led to other sources are Fulton's 1866 Freedmen's Bank application, which I'll tell you the things it tells me, and also a profile written about him in 1887 in the Cleveland Gazette, which is where we get this photograph, or this image, this etching. It's the only known image of Edward Fulton that I found. So his Freedman Bank application, it was, he filled out this application in January 1866 in Memphis, but it tells us great things about his background. It tells us that his master was he's a former slave, so his former owner was Levi Gobin in Livingston County, Missouri. It tells us he was born in Louisville, Kentucky. His residence, although he's applying for this application in Memphis, he says his last residence was Quincy, Illinois. I think it also lists some of his names of his children in there. And it says his occupation is an intelligence officer, which is kind of impressive for an African American in 1866. And then the other excellent source is this profile. It says he's born in Louisville, Kentucky in 1833. He says he spent his early days in Chicago in the anti-slavery cause, so we got this connection to abolitionist movement. He also was claiming that he helped recruit soldiers for the 54th Massachusetts and other units, which is another impressive part of his resume here. And it also says he moved to Chico County after the Civil War. So again, we got this connection to Arkansas. I knew that he was in Drew County and Little Rock, but before I found this source, I would have never thought to look for him in Chico County. So Edward Allen Fulton, a former slave in Kentucky and Missouri, likely arrived in Arkansas in 1866. He was part of a wave of idealistic African-American leaders who came south after the Civil War seeking opportunity. Fulton began his life as a slave, but spent a decade in Chicago's abolitionist community. In Arkansas, he held political offices. He fought for civil rights and at times fought seemingly unnecessarily political fights. Like many African-American political leaders in the 19th century, his story has been forgotten and fallen into obscurity. So this is not going to be a complete story about Fulton, but this is part of my attempt to lift him and other people like him out of obscurity. So from limited sources, limited documentation, it's possible to trace Fulton's life from slavery to freedom. Born a slave in Louisville, Kentucky on March 20th, 1833, Fulton identified Levi Gobin as his former plantation master. Gobin moved from Jefferson County, Kentucky to Livingston County, Missouri in 1831, but it is not clear when Fulton arrived. When Fulton began publishing the Little Rock Sun in 1884, he wrote, "The editor of this paper was born a slave and has been robbed of the years of toil and opportunity of getting an education." Levi Gobin's Northwest Missouri farm had 7 slaves in 1850, including one 18-year-old mulatto male. None of Gobin's slaves, according to the 1850s slave schedule, were runaways. If Fulton was that 18-year-old male, he likely soon left Gobin's farm. So here's a map up here that kind of gives you the places that Fulton's associated with in his early life. He's born in Kentucky. We know he's a slave in Livingston County. Can y'all see that dot up there? I can see it over there, but I can't see it over here.
Not on the white.
No, okay. So he's a slave in the Livingston County, Missouri. Then he's in Chicago, and then, as I'll tell you in a second, he ends up in Quincy, Illinois. So according to one source, he received an education in Chicago. The earliest record of Fulton in that city is 1851. Around 1854, at age 21, he married a Louisiana native, Anna Fulton. We don't know her maiden name, age 19. By 1860, their home was full of children: Maria, age 6, William, age 4, and Mary, age 1. City directories and other sources identify Fulton employed by the Chicago Democratic Press in 1854, as a clerk in 1858, and employed by John Jones and Company from 1859 to 1860, as a waiter in 1861, and as a sleeping car porter on the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad in 1862. Fulton's employment by John Jones from 59 to 60 is a connection to one of Chicago's most prominent abolitionists. It also confirms an 1887 claim in the Cleveland Gazette. He, Fulton, was an earnest and zealous laborer in the anti-slavery cause in Illinois from 51 to 1860, having associated with him Dr. Charles Dyer, John Jones, Charles and John M. Langston, H.O. Wagner, Lewis Hayden, and others. So I've got 2 sources that connect him to Jones. I got his 1887 biographical sketch, and then the city directories also put him with Jones, working for Jones. Jones, an abolitionist supporter of the Underground Railroad, supported himself with investments in real estate and a tailoring business. Jones arrived in Chicago around 1845 as a free man. Politically active, he penned articles and pamphlets attacking Illinois' black laws and the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And he met with black and white abolitionists, including John Brown and Frederick Douglass. Jones's daughter recalled their home was the local headquarters of the Underground Railroad, and he was responsible for sending hundreds of fugitives to Canada. So Fulton and Jones certainly knew each other by 1851, but Fulton may have met Jones earlier on the Underground Railroad as he escaped enslavement in Missouri. In 1851, the two are listed as founding members of Chicago's North Star Lodge of Free and Accepted Masons. Working for Jones in the late 1850s, the younger Fulton seems to have used Jones' career as a tailor and activist as a model. Fulton's position with the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad expanded his options, and he soon settled his family in Quincy, Illinois, the western terminus of the railroad on the Mississippi River. As early as July 1862, Fulton announced in the Quincy Daily Whig the opening of his own tailor shop. So there we have an advertisement for Fulton opening his tailor shop in July 1862 in Quincy. So it says, "Old clothing renovated. E.A. Taylor has opened in this city an establishment for the purpose of renovating wearing apparel and is prepared to extract grease, tar, paint, blemishes of all kind, and every description of wearing apparel, rendering it good as new. He warrants all his work and will refund the money in case of the renovation is not permanent. Having known Mr. Fulton for some years as a superior workman in this line, we have no hesitation in saying that he is fully competent to do anything entrusted him in a satisfactory and workmanlike manner." There are similar advertisements for John Jones in Chicago papers. Soon after his arrival in Quincy, Fulton entered into politics. In October 1862, Fulton was appointed as an advisor to the Board of Education for Quincy's new colored school. In January 1863, he presided over a meeting of colored citizens to celebrate Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Fulton stated, so this is in the Quincy paper, Fulton stated, "We had met to celebrate the birthday of a nation, the downfall of slavery, and to give honor and thanks to that great friend of the downtrodden and oppressed." So Fulton's listed as a bartender in the 1863 Quincy City Directory, but it's likely that the Civil War pulled him away from the city and his family that year. He registered for the draft in Quincy in June or July of 1863, and then again in July of 1863, he shows up on another draft form in St. Louis, Missouri. So he's registering the draft twice for some reason. There's no record of his service, though, in the Union Army, and he may have served the Union Army in an unofficial capacity. The 1887 biographical sketch gives Fulton the honorific title of colonel and claims he was a recruiter for the 54th Massachusetts Infantry and other colored units. Jones, his mentor, was also known to be an active recruiter. Historian Ira Berlin wrote in Freedom, a documentary history of emancipation, with long years of experience in the abolition movement and deep roots in northern black communities, men like Martin Delaney and other names he lists, as well as John Jones, had no trouble locating recruits and forwarding them to the regimental rendezvous in New England. So mercenary recruiters, possibly like Fulton, received as much as $2 per recruit. So in this next section of his life, we've got Fulton. He's left Quincy, Illinois. He ends up in St. Louis in that draft form. He's going to end up in Memphis. He's going to end up in Chico County. He's going to end up in Little Rock, and then also in Drew County in Monticello. So Fulton arrived in Memphis sometime before October 1865. That month, he wrote to the newly created Freedmen's Bureau, charged with protecting the rights of newly freed slaves, to offer his services as a labor agent. Writing to General O.O. Howard, he wrote, "I am a colored man and have for some time been doing business for the colored people of this part of the country. You will see my business card. I have at the present time order for about 1,000 laborers to do different kinds of work, farming, chopping wood, etc." He continued, offering a plan to appoint one good colored man for each district or sub-district whose business it should be to hunt up those persons who may be suffering for want of work, to give them places where they can get good wages. As for myself, I can furnish for 1,500 hands at wages ranging from $8 to $20 per month. So he's offering his service to the Freedmen's Bureau as a labor agent. I have no idea how this played out. It seems like it didn't play out because he doesn't stay in Memphis very long. In the Freedmen's Bureau record, this letter is there. He says he's attached his card to the letter, but the card does not survive in the records, unfortunately. So the next month, still in Memphis, January 1866, Fulton lists his occupation as intelligence officer on a Freedmen's Bank application. So this may be in connection to his being a recruiter. He may have been a spy for the Union Army. There's just no records of this. But if he was in fact a Union spy, he may have been what Union officers called a black dispatch or a black dispatcher. But again, there's no records to even look at that I'm aware of. So in his testimony before Senate Committee in 1872, he claimed he had been in Arkansas since 1866. In another source, he claimed he came to Chico County, Arkansas and engaged in agriculture for 2 years. So he's getting involved in farming in Chico County. He's probably arriving in the spring. The next record we have is in September 1866 in the Chico County Courthouse, is a record between him and James W. Mason, in which Fulton mortgages an entire cotton crop grown at Redleaf Plantation giving it to James Mason. And this is a photograph of James Mason right here. James Worthington Mason was the son of Elijah Worthington, the largest planter in Chico County. He was also the son of one of Worthington's slaves. Elijah sent James Mason to Oberlin for an education in the 1850s, early 1850s, and then sent him to France, to Saint-Cyr, the French military academy. And so Mason comes back to Chico County probably around 1861 when the Civil War starts. Elijah ends up in Texas with most of his slaves, and James and his sister Martha are taking care of the plantation. And James becomes the political boss of the county. But in 1866, the war is just over. Mason is trying to get his footing as a planter himself in his father's footsteps, and he enters in this arrangement. I think it's the first record of Mason in the Chico County records, the courthouse, I believe. So 2 years later, Fulton is listed in the tax rolls for Pulaski County. But in July 1869, he attended a meeting of colored voters of Little Rock and the vicinity. So I'm getting that wrong. So in July 1869, he's in Little Rock, but in September 1869, he attended the Brindletail Republican Convention as a representative from Drew County. So somehow he's shifting from Pulaski County to Drew County. And then the next year, 1870, the 37-year-old Fulton is recorded as the U.S. census taker for that county. Ironically, he's listed as illiterate on the census form that he is on. He's not illiterate. He's got him as working in newspapers. He's writing articles or speeches that get published in the Quincy paper. And if he's a census taker, he has to be able to write. So that's obviously wrong. But on this 1870 census form, he has $1,250 in real estate and personal property, and he's living with a new wife, Missouri-born Amelia, age 31. So I don't know what happens to the first wife. I suspect maybe when he ends up in St. Louis, registering for the draft that second time, that he has found a new wife, possibly. In 1870, Drew County was still recovering from the Civil War. Farm values amounted to only 53% of antebellum holdings, and the amount of improved farmland had decreased. And so you can kind of see in this chart here, comparing 1860 to 1870. While the county had grown rapidly in the antebellum era, the county's population was stagnant, increasing only by 9%, from 9,078 in 1860 to 9,960 in 1870. The county's proportion of African American residents also remained the same at 38% and 39%. Black residents were still the main source of labor in the county. However, the next 10 years, their numbers would swell to 47% of the population. So this is fertile territory for an African American leader to come in with a growing African American population. But there were some hurdles first. Conservatives and former Confederates dominated Drew County in the first years of Reconstruction. Drew County elected Colonel Iverson L. Brooks, a former Confederate colonel, and Benjamin Collins to the General Assembly in 1866. Both the Arkansas Gazette and the liberal Morning Republican described the Conservative Democratic Party as the white man's party. In the lead up to the Arkansas Constitutional Convention of 1868, Drew County conservatives passed, these are the quote from the paper, patriotic resolutions favoring white man's government and return to constitutional government. So Fulton's politics are going to be much different than these first guys elected in Reconstruction. So the convention crafted, the 1868 convention crafted a constitution that provided universal male suffrage, equality before the law, and allowed persons to hold office regardless of previous servitude, and provided free yet segregated education. The convention passed its document, but Drew County's representatives voted against the new constitution and even maneuvered to scuttle the whole proceedings. And one kind of aside, this guy, Iverson L. Brooks, other historians of Drew County have gotten Iverson L. Brooks confused with another Brooks. A few years later, there's an African American leader in Drew County who has the last name Brooks. His name was L.L. Brooks, and somehow the I and the L have got confused, and some people have claimed that L.L. Brooks is the first African American ever elected in the state of Arkansas, because he's elected to the state constitutional convention in the General Assembly in 1866, but that's I.L. Brooks, not L.L. Brooks. So that's one thing that got me, I remember now, that's one thing that got me started on this. Someone contacted me and said, I've heard about this African American who got elected in 1866, which is just impossible because this Constitutional Convention they the 1868 convention has not been gone through, which gave blacks the right to vote. So that would be remarkable, but it didn't happen. But you can find a couple of sources. James Leslie has it in one of his books, and some of the local histories also mention it. Still, the people of Arkansas, including many of the new registered African Americans, had to ratify this new constitutional document. At a conservative meeting in Monticello in the spring of 1866, Colonel Brooks spoke against the new Constitution. He lamented the Confederacy's defeat and stated he wanted to keep a better legacy to bequeath to his children. And he had honestly and faithfully done all he could to maintain and firmly establish a Southern Confederacy. And he wanted his constituents to vote down that quiet monstrosity. With some counties under martial law, the Constitution passed that summer, which paved the way for Fulton to be elected in 1870 from Drew County as a Republican to the General Assembly. Let's see, what have I got here? So I don't have this written up in my paper here, but this is a remarkable painting. This is a painting done by James H. Smith, another African American in Drew County. I'm not sure. I know he was appointed postmaster in Monticello around the time that Fulton's also appointed postmaster. But this painting is attributed to him, and it's called Election Day, and it shows African American voters. So this is like an amazing, any photo. I don't know if there be any photos in Arkansas of African Americans voting, but we do. This painting exists, and this painting hung in the Drew County Museum up until the election of the new mayor, and now the new mayor, Zach Tucker, has this hanging behind him. So if you can find YouTube videos or his videos on Facebook where he posts what's going on in Monticello, you can see this in the background. But it's remarkable. We've got African Americans on the lawn of the courthouse on Election Day, so it's a pretty remarkable document. So in November 1870, Drew County elected Edward A. Fulton to the General Assembly. He was one of 13 black legislators elected to the General Assembly that year. Joining Fulton from Drew County were two white Republicans, Charles Preddy and Herbert Marr. The Little Rock Republican described Fulton as a man of considerable intelligence and fair education. Active participants in the legislative process, black legislators engaged in debate, introduced bills, and voted. In general, black lawmakers tend to support civil rights, education, public improvements, and immigration to the state. However, as Edward Fulton proves, they could also form political factions. In the House, Fulton sat on the House Committee on Federal Relations, and like most of his fellow black lawmakers, he opposed restoring the voting rights of former Confederates. Fulton also introduced a bill that would appropriate state lands for homesteads. The bill passed the House and Senate, but Governor Powell Clayton left it unsigned. There we go. In the House, sorry, I said that. Despite controlling the General Assembly, it was Republican political infighting, the split between liberal Brindletail Republicans and regular Republicans that marked the session. Fulton himself sided with the liberal branch, the Brindletails, led by Joseph Brooks, a former abolitionist from Ohio. The liberals were critical of Republican Governor Powell Clayton's executive powers and often accused him of corruption. During the session, Fulton voted against the impeachment of Lieutenant Governor James M. Johnson's, Clayton's primary political enemy. Fulton, feeling the political pressures that he had sold out democracy, said he defended his vote against these scoundrels and liars and affirmed he was a Republican and always intended to be one, sent by his constituents to represent their interests, and he intended to do what he thought was right. When liberal Republicans sought payback, Fulton voted for the impeachment of Governor Clayton and sat on a 5-man committee to investigate the governor. Ultimately, the committee found no evidence against Governor Clayton, but Fulton's ties to the liberal Republicans remained. With the session over, Fulton continued to antagonize Clayton, though, and the regular Republicans. In a speech to a black audience in Monticello that May, he declared he looked upon Clayton as the worst man in the state and recounted accusations of bribery and corruption. So it just this infighting with the Republican Party just seems kind of, I mean, I guess it's not unheard of, but it just seems like it's over the top a little bit. But it points to Fulton's own brand of kind of conservative Republican politics that we'll see later on in his career too. After Fulton's service in the General Assembly, he was appointed postmaster in Monticello. And you think that's a plum political positions, but these political infighting erupted again and fueled a violent confrontation between Fulton and a young African American. In early August 1871, John Murray, a 16-year-old African American from Pine Bluff, was in Monticello to obtain a teacher's certificate from Fulton's old house colleague, Herbert Marr, who was now superintendent of schools. Fulton learned Murray was calling him a sellout, probably because of these previous things that had been said in the House earlier. Murray, it was reported, stated Fulton was not endorsed by the colored people of Jefferson County, and he was a Democrat that he was actually a Democrat that only wanted an opportunity to sell out the colored people. So Fulton got wind of all this, and confronted Murray and beat him. Fulton seems to have been arrested, and he paid his fine for breach of town ordinances. So Murray was not done, however. Under advice from Marr, according to some papers, he charged Fulton with assault with intent to kill. And when officers again arrested Fulton at his home, Murray appeared and shot him twice in the back and arm, reportedly with Marr's gun. So you never know when these things get reported in the paper if they're just rumors that are getting spread. But he actually was shot, though. Somehow Fulton survived his wounds and used the incident to his political advantage the next spring in his bid for the Secretary of State under the banner of the liberal Republicans. What do I have next? So the next spring, in April 1872, Fulton's views on civil rights received national attention. As the U.S. Senate took up Charles Sumner's Civil Rights Bill, Fulton gave his support to the bill with a letter to Senator Sumner. During the debate, Senator Sumner read excerpts of Fulton's letter on the Senate floor. So this gets published in the Congressional Record. And then when people write biographies of Sumner, this letter gets mentioned quite a bit. So Fulton, in his letter, endorsed a national civil rights bill as well as offered the restoration of voting rights for former Confederates. So he's kind of, we got these kind of conservative ideas in here of, he's for that kind of African American ideal of equal rights for African Americans, which is kind of universal amongst these African American leaders. Kind of their soul, but he's also offering this olive branch of offering voting rights to former Confederates. So I'm not going to read the letter. It's about 5 or 6 paragraphs, but you can look it up in the Congressional Record and other sources. During the spring campaign for Secretary of State, Fulton began publishing the Drew County Freeman. So no issues survive, unfortunately, but the Arkansas Gazette described the paper as a small weekly campaign sheet published for 75 cents. So with the Republican Party split, the Morning Republican newspaper supported the regular Republicans and opposed Fulton. It stated, E.A. Fulton, a colored man, has lost the confidence of the colored people by voting with the Democracy, the Democrats, in the legislature last winter. His scurriest sheet abounds with attacks on the colored man of the state, made up generally by the repetition of the worst of the word nigger. If a colored man offends Mr. Fulton by refusing to follow his lead, such a man is doomed to be described in Drew County Freeman as Marr's nigger or someone else's nigger. And of such are the colored greeley men of the state, in reference to the national campaign. So the regular Republicans do not like Fulton, and they're saying, and they're describing his newspaper as his tactic of attacking people that oppose him. So the Liberal Republican ticket in 1872 was soundly defeated, possibly due to fraud, according to some sources. Fulton does not appear to have run for office again, but he was reappointed as postmaster in 1874 and engaged in a number of land transactions during the remainder of the decade in Drew County. By 1880, Fulton had soured on his opportunities in Drew County, as had other African American families. So Reconstruction is over, and life is starting to change for these African Americans In the previous 6 years, Reconstruction had ended in many counties. Democrats had redeemed and claimed political offices. In the spring of 1880, Fulton led a group of African Americans and relocated them to western Iowa. So that's why I've got this map up here. It shows you Monticello, and it shows you Ackley, Iowa up there. So the Ackley Enterprise on October 10, 1880 reported 35 to 40 colored people, men, women, and children ranging from 6 weeks old to 75 years arrived from Monticello, Drew County, Arkansas in the charge of E.A. Fulton. The group expected to work and farm, according to the paper, and they also reported through Fulton the grievances of these Arkansas families. They had been swindled and cheated out of their earnings due to the furnished system. They were taxed oppressively for schools that their children could not attend. They had no political or social rights, and they feared being shot for the least provocation. So this is coming at the time of the Exoduster movement, where you've got Reconstruction is ending, and you have these southern blacks who are afraid of what's going to happen now that Reconstruction's over, and people are getting Kansas fever. The town of Nicodemus is founded in 1879. So I think Fulton intended that to take these families to Kansas or Nebraska, but somehow they ended up in Iowa. And I think there's another source, I don't have it written up in here, that says he was representing 150 families in Drew County, but it looks like only maybe a fourth to half of those actually made this journey to Iowa. So let me have another slide right here. So on their trip, they went from Drew County to Pine Bluff, but they could not take the railroads. They were not, someone intervened and said that these people can't take the railroads, so they had to go by team. I assume that's by horses and mules, and then they were to take a boat from Pine Bluff to Cairo, Illinois, and then a rail to Iowa. And then so if you look at this, they're arriving in 1880, early 1880. So you can use the census. I can use the census as a tool to figure out who went. And so I just searched in Heritage Quest on the census, who are people born in Arkansas living in this county in Iowa. And I get 36 African Americans living in Hardin County, Iowa, who were born in Arkansas. These are mostly children. So I didn't dig into any further to see what these households are like. But these are 35 children and one adult who show up. So these are probably mostly new migrants into Drew County from other parts of the South, who then are tired of what's going on in Drew County and then want to go north. All right, so Fulton does not stick around in Iowa with these folks. He returns to St. Louis, which is probably where his wife's hometown, and he started another tailoring business and continued to be active in politics. I don't know exactly what kind of political stuff he did in St. Louis, but there's one article that says he's involved in politics, but I don't know exactly what it is. Around 1883 or early 1884, he returns to Arkansas as the owner and managing editor of several Little Rock newspapers. So these newspapers are going to be he works at the Arkansas Mansion. He founds the Little Rock Sun, or the Fulton Sun, or just the Sun. It goes through several different name changes, and then the National Democrat. And then he'll end up back in St. Louis, and that's where he'll die. I've got some slides in between there. So in 1884, he established Fulton Sun, or the Little Rock Sun. Unfortunately, no copies survive again. In one source, the Sun is described as an independent Republican paper, and the paper was billed itself as a paper for the people. That's from this advertisement right here. It's a paper for the people devoted to education, literature, the family circle, general news, the political, agricultural, and commercial interests of the people of our state and country without distinction of race, creed, or previous condition. So it's not specifically an African American paper. That was probably his main audience, but he's probably trying to make it a little bit broader as well. And he's also, it's first his paper, then he partners with Julian T. Bailey, as you can see in this advertisement. And then, I don't know exactly, I guess that paper probably goes out of business. In December 1889, Fulton teams up with another he's a former legislator and African-American, William Hines Furbish, who's now an attorney in Little Rock, to announce the publication of the National Democrat, a Democratic paper for colored citizens of Arkansas. So this one specifically, another probably kind of a campaign sheet for black Democrats. The two men hope to heal the prejudice waged against the party by the old gang and to cultivate better feelings between the races. In the Arkansas Gazette, they published an extensive list of endorsements for the paper because we've got, white Democrats would love to have black Democrats voting for them rather than voting for union laborists or the Republican Party. And this is a photo of William Hines Furbish, or two different photos of William Hines Furbish. The photo on the right is probably around 1879, about a decade before these events I'm talking about. And the photo on the right is 1879, and the photo on the left is probably early 1870s. I don't know what Furbish looked like in 89. Those are the only two photos I'm aware of him. So in the 1890 election, Democrats defeated the alliance of labor unions and Republicans, just as they had done in 1888. However, the election again was close. Operations like Fulton's and Furbish's National Democrat were designed to bring black voters to the Democratic Party. Fulton and Furbish's failure, though, showed black Democrats were of little use to white Democrats. Democrats would then turn to disfranchisement of African American voters through election reforms that hindered illiterate voters and eventually a poll tax that also excluded them. So curiously, by 1890, Fulton became the owner of a private colored park called Fulton's Park at the corner of 13th and Valentine Streets at the southwestern edge of the city and near the end of the electric, I guess the trolley line. So in 1900, the park was described as fitted up for the exclusive use of the colored people. So the first map that I could find it on is this 1913 fire insurance map. That's the 1890 city directory that it mentions, he's a proprietor of Fulton's Park. And then that address, I think this is Valentine Street, and here's 13th Street. So the corner of Valentine and 13th in 1913 was Highland Park. So I assume that's Fulton's Park. I kind of got carried away here. That's where it is today. The shape of the block is very similar, so it hasn't changed much. It's no longer a park. There are houses there that look like they were probably built, I don't know, late 1910s, 1920s, 30s, somewhere in there, my guess. So it's no longer a park. By 1894, Fulton was back in St. Louis. This is a laborer, nurse, and washer in the city directories until his death on December 22nd, 1906, at the age of 76. He's buried in the Greenwood Cemetery in that cemetery. So it seems like his life was pretty much reduced. He was no longer a leader. He was now, these jobs where he was a laborer. So what can we say about his puzzle with the few pieces that we have? He was consistently a proponent of freedom and civil rights for African Americans, from his time as an abolitionist all the way through his time as a political leader and newspaper editor in Arkansas. But we can definitely say that his politics were marred by intra-partisanship. Joseph Brooks and Fulton, I think that probably, Fulton, this is who he was. It wasn't just him being expedient. But the leader of the liberal Republicans, Joseph Brooks, was also a former abolitionist, so they had similar backgrounds that may have drawn him to it. But siding with liberal Republicans also showed a belief in a compromise and working with white conservatives. By the late 1880s and early 1890s, this may have seemed like a practical path, given the fact that even Republicans were starting to segregate, and there was a lily white Republican movement. So even the Republican Party was no longer a home for some of these leaders. So it may have been a practical path to try to align with some of these Democrats that might support them. But ultimately, we know what happens with that, with disfranchisement. But what I think is tragic, though, is that with the loss of black leadership after Reconstruction in 1874 and disfranchisement by 1891, black leaders like Fulton were simply cut out of the political process. which in turn cut out the interests of African Americans. This is nothing new that I'm talking about here. So former leaders like Fulton, without a place, lived reduced lives as laborers, shoe shiners, and porters. At the same time, African Americans in the South had to live under Jim Crow for nearly 100 years. And so I don't know what Fulton's take on this was, but I've done a lot of work on just African American legislators in general, and I'm not aware of any of them that have very few of them had any kind of legacy. Once disfranchisement occurred and their political careers ended, pretty much, they didn't have any children that had political careers. I think of one exception. I think one of Representative Dawson had a child, Dawson, who was active in politics in the, I think, 1940s, 1950s. But most of them, didn't have a political legacy. I'm sure many of them had legacies in the church, but probably many of them had this fate like Fulton or the subject of this article from I think it's the 19-teens. I forgot what year it is. This is from the Arkansas Gazette, in which one former legislator, Peter Booth, who was a representative in Jefferson County, is now a shoe shiner in the Capitol. And the whole article just makes fun of him that the shoe shiner, just think of how funny it is. This shoe shiner used to be in our Capitol and be a lawmaker. So it's just sad. And so that's pretty much my presentation. Just end on that low note. So, any questions about any of this? Yes, ma'am.
Me again. Mars. Tell me about Mars.
Herbert Marr.
Right. Back in
so he was a former Union. I guess I don't know if he was an officer. He was a former Union soldier. He was born in Canada, but probably grew up in Chicago, and somehow he ends up in Drew County too. I don't know exactly how. And he's elected to the legislature the same year as Fulton. And then after the session, he's superintendent of education in Drew County. And so I don't know all the ins and outs of the politics that are going on in the county, but they're part of that Republican establishment that's starting to form.
And the Brindletail.
Brindletail, yeah.
Yeah. What's the spell?
It refers to the whip of, and supposedly Joseph Brooks' voice sounded like that whip. So we don't have any recordings of Brooks' voice, I don't think, but.
So bridle, like a horse's bridle.
Yeah, right.
Right. Okay.
They were called liberal Republicans or the Brindletail Republicans. Yeah. And if you go to the Arkansas Encyclopedia, there's articles on Joseph Brooks and others.
What were the ages of those children that he took to Iowa?
It's
odd that all of them except one were
well, but so what I'm saying is that
born in Arkansas, right?
when I just search for people born in Arkansas, black people born in Arkansas living in that county, I get mostly children. If I had dug a little further and clicked on Willie McCoy, I probably could have found an adult that he was with. And that adult was probably born in Mississippi or Louisiana or Alabama or somewhere. So they were probably recent migrants within the 10 years into Drew County. I think I said earlier that in that 10 years that Fulton was there, that the black population increased 49% or something like that.
So he was a real leader that he could convince that many people to go with him.
Right. Yeah. And I think there are articles talking about him traveling up there, kind of laying the groundwork for this group to come in. I don't know what happens to him when you look in. Well, we can't look in the 1890 census; doesn't exist. When we look in the 1900 census, these people aren't in that county anymore. I don't know where they end up.
What kind of occupations did they have, or did you give?
Well, I think the articles say that they intended to farm, but I know one of them dies. I think I did find an article that mentioned that one of the older people died and was buried after they arrived. Thank you.